excited that Nicole is joining us. I wanted to have her join us because the Raise the Roof Coalition and then eBase and Nicole specifically are leading the organizing on the ground in Contra Costa County. And I think they're one of the jurisdictions that I've seen that right out of the gate analyze kind of like what are the gaps that we're going to see and how do we move forward as quickly as we can to plug those gaps. And Nicole also brings a lot of experience from talking with folks on the ground as an organizer to understand what the loopholes are and then how we plug those. So Nicole, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Thanks again for having me here today. Excited to share with you what we've been seeing on the ground. And thanks to Madeline for really giving a comprehensive overview, because as an organizer, yeah, I agree, it's very complicated, and I'm still trying to wrap my head around this all and how to use this to educate tenants. But yeah, I am from eBase, the East Bay Alliance for a Sustainable Economy. You can go to the next slide. And we are an economic justice and racial justice organization based in both Contra Costa and Alameda County. I am the Contra Costa community organizer, so my work is only focused in Contra Costa, mainly Concord, but I think since COVID and the response to the needs during this time, we shifted to a lot of the county level advocacy. And so what eBase does is we build alliances between different community groups, labor groups, to create change that's needed in low income communities of color. Our work varies, but my work has been mainly focused on housing justice, and as opposed to in Alameda County, I think it's been a lot around workers' rights and the right to recall work that I think was mentioned earlier. The next slide, please. So one of those alliances that we help convene in Contra Costa is the Raise the Roof Coalition. We're made up of various groups that I have listed here, but we work on the interwoven front of immigrant protections and housing protections to really bring light to how our communities are not only facing displacement from things like deportation, but also from eviction and rent increases, and how we need to think about these intersectionally so that we can address ways to really remain rooted in our community. Next slide, please. So I'm going to go over some real stories that bring light to the gaps in the law that Madeline was talking about. I have stories here to show how these exceptions in the law to who can be evicted for what play out in real life. As an organizer, this is what I deal with every day, hearing from people, and so I just want to bring some more of that humanness to this all, because I think we can get wrapped up in the legal side of things, and it is very confusing. So I hope this can bring more light to how this work plays out on the ground. So the first loophole was mentioned, the owner move-in exception. So under 3088 and also the Contra Costa moratorium, tenants can be evicted if the owner would like to move in or move in a family member. And so Brian is an example of someone who was affected by this loophole. He was displaced from Concord to Antioch after receiving a 60-day notice to vacate because the landlord stated he'd needed to move into the unit. Luckily, Brian found a new place in time, which is really not common for what I see. So he was kind of an outlier in that sense. But he moved out, and out of curiosity, he looked up his unit on the internet and actually found that it was up for rent again for a higher amount of rent, meaning that the landlord used this exception to kick Brian out and get a higher paying tenant. Next slide, please. The second loophole we've seen is the removal from the market exception. So landlords are entitled to evict a tenant if they need to or want to take the property off the market. This is also known as the Ellis Act. So Manuel is an example of someone who is affected by this. He received a 60-day notice due to this exception. He has lived in this home for 10 years. Back in September, he received a 60-day notice stating that the landlord was removing the property from the market. Coincidentally, this was right after Manuel was unable to pay rent. So due to COVID, like many other people, Manuel has been experiencing a partial loss of income. He was not able to pay rent for September and had paid partial rent prior to that. And so in July, he actually reported a broken stove, and the landlord took a pretty long time to repair that, 10 days. And that forced Manuel to use the money he did initially have set aside for rent money to buy already cooked food, like takeout food. And so right after that happened, where he was unable to pay any rent at all, as opposed to the partial rent he had been paying prior, he received this notice around the removal from the market exception. And so we can only guess, what the real reason behind that was. So a lot of these times, these exceptions are used as a retaliatory measure. Next slide, please. The third loophole is actually the public health and safety exception. And I want to just make a note that we recognize that there is still the need to limit evictions to this one exception, but I just wanted to flag that even this is used as a loophole. And so Jesus was an example of someone affected by that. He parked in the wrong spot at his complex. He's a tenant in Concord. He parked in the reserved parking lot and later received a 3-day eviction notice stating that his behavior was a nuisance and presents a public health and safety issue.
No, they didn't.
I know. And so I think this is the last loophole, but non-payment evictions prior to March 1st not being covered. So AB 3888 only covers evictions that are related to not being able to pay rent due to COVID-19. If it was sent after March, right? And so this is a story of someone who was unable to pay rent prior to that date. So in Richmond, a gig driver and his family, they're currently facing eviction due to being unable to pay rent back in January when his wife became sick and could no longer make the rent of $2,000 a month. They had been paying rent using their combined income, and so when she became sick and could no longer work, they couldn't make that rent in January. And so since COVID, transitioning into how to deal with the new laws, they had been experiencing a lot of communication issues with their landlord and not actually being refused the right to pay the rent that they owed even after coming up with the money. And so the landlord is currently threatening to evict them as soon as they can. And just to give an example, like in more practical terms of the financial distress people are going through, this driver worked 6 hours last week, made $70, but put $30 in his tank, meaning that he only earned 40 hours for his 6 hours of work that week, which is less than minimum wage. And so I think this just shows people are really trying to make ends meet. They're even choosing to sometimes forego their other necessities like food for their children to be able to pay some rent to kind of fend off the harassment, but it's impossible sometimes. The next slide, please. Yeah, and so I think as a tenant organizer, the biggest thing I come across is just general harassment. That is really hard to enforce anti-harassment laws. It's really hard to prove a lot of the time. It puts the burden a lot, like most things, on the tenant to assert their rights, but harassment creates a lot of fear. And so Eileen is someone who recently called our tenant hotline, who is a senior citizen in Concord, has also been unable to pay rent during COVID-19. And now her landlord is actually cutting off the power in her unit and withholding her mail. And I wanted to also highlight that on top of this harassment that people are dealing with, a lot of these tenants live in very uninhabitable conditions. And so Eileen is an example of this, where she has mold and a broken toilet, roaches and mice. And so when tenants are faced with this harassment, they know that it's probably easier to stay silent around these conditions for fear of creating more of a problem, because they don't want to lose their housing. And so when we're talking about, health and housing, it's this is, one very concrete way that tenants are affected, and their health is being affected. And I didn't put it on the slide, but I wanted to name also that just complete illegal evictions are continuing during this time. So I think Madeline mentioned, we've seen a lot of tenants just come through to our tenant clinics that we help host that just receive notices to evict that don't state anything, even verbal notices. So we have one tenant right now who's dealing with a verbal eviction notice where the landlord's harassing, and so he's scared to leave his home because he doesn't know if he's gonna come and have the door be locked up. So that's just another example. And lastly, I wanted, before we get into some of the solutions, I wanted to highlight this issue around rent increases, because although evictions are obviously a priority that we need to address, AB 3088 says nothing about rent increases during this time. And although the Contra Costa moratorium and local city ordinances do stop rent increases on certain properties, not all tenants are covered by that protection. And so I wanted to bring light to this, because when we're talking about instability, this is something that is being inflicted on residents on top of the already financial burden that they're experiencing. And so we actually are working currently with a 300 unit building in Concord that's receiving a legal rent increase because they're not covered under the laws due to the type of housing they're living in. They're exempt from this protection. And so although it is lawful, as organizers, we don't think that's just, right. And so how do we work with tenants to build their power in ways that can address these issues? And along with the legal rent increases, we are also seeing illegal rent increases in whole buildings as well. So I think these stories are really to bring light to this issue around enforcement and implementation. Like I mentioned before, a lot of, there's no one really in implementing or enforcing tenant laws. And so a lot of times, if not the whole time, it's dependent on the tenant themselves. The burden's put on them to implement. And I would say the majority of people we work with end up being undocumented immigrants, people of color that are really vulnerable and do not always feel safe enough to assert those rights. And so the issue around implementing them, the burden falls also on the community members and social service agencies, like, to do that education and do that case management. But I wanted to, bring light to how we also need government officials to step up and do their part in allowing us to do our jobs as well by investing in resources. So I'll be going over now some of the our main demands from the Raise the Roof Coalition to better address these issues. Next slide, please. So these are the Board of Supervisors of Contra Costa. We've been advocating on the county level for eviction protections during this time. And so what we really need is for the board to continue doing their job by addressing this, even if state and federal level laws have kicked in. I think Madeline did a great job about showing how confusing it is and how even though we have these so-called protections, there's gaps, and we need our local leadership to step in. Just by my own experience advocating on the county level, they tend to really let the state and federal laws kind of take control. There's a lot of waiting around. And I think this is not the time, you know, we are living in a different moment now. And so I think just wanting to stress that importance that we need folks to really step up, continue stepping up. Next slide, please. So our first demand to the county Contra Costa Board of Supervisors is to close these loopholes by restricting the definition of just cause for evictions. And so this is what Madeline was talking about. We are actually using that strategy by saying that you need to reduce the number of reasons for why people can be evicted. So no more owner move-in, no more removal from market, and only restricted to tenant if there is an imminent threat to public health and safety. Next slide. The second demand is to invest in tenant outreach and education to ensure that renters receive the full protections of AB 3088 and the county's moratorium. Again, it's very confusing, and we need real, comprehensive, multilingual community outreach when it comes to these protections. You know, as a community organizer, I'm already invested in doing that work, trying to wrap my head around things, but I think the county really has, we really believe the county has the resources to actually reach the number of people we need to reach. I'm only one person, I work only with a couple other people, and it's really hard sometimes to reach the amount of people we need to reach, and sometimes we don't hear about things until after the fact. And so we want the county to really invest in things like radio messages, billboards, newsletters, written announcements sent to, you know, constituents of the county, working with service providers maybe to send materials so that we can reach who we need to reach. The third demand is for the county to invest in legal services to make these protections really mean something. Tenants actually appear in court 90% of the time without any legal representation. As part of my job, I've been organizing free legal clinics every month for tenants in Concord, and this is solely like unfunded. It's total volunteer based. I have lawyers volunteer every month, and it's restricted to consultation and not representation. So although it's a really vital resource, I think that we've been holding down, I think there's a lot more room to grow in terms of the county investing in these services so that tenants can actually have some sort of legal defense when it comes to these illegal actions that are taking place. The last demand is to have the county use CARES Act money to create a rental assistance program that will help pay the 25% that the tenant owes. If folks remember, Madeline talked about how in AB 3088, a tenant is obligated to pay 25% of the rent owed from September to January. And so we would like the county to actually use CARES Act money to help fund that for people. So we'd like folks to join us to help make this possible. And so next Tuesday, the Board of Supervisors is actually meeting. Next slide, please, sorry. The Board of Supervisors in Contra Costa is meeting to discuss tenant protections. Unfortunately, they have they posted their agenda, and they're only going to be looking into continuing with the same protection rather than closing the loopholes that I just talked about. And so we really need them to listen to these demands and take seriously the need for their own leadership. If you live in Contra Costa, or even if you don't and you work with people who do live there and are affected by these issues, we really ask that that's one concrete way to show up and take action so that we can keep people housed. And I think what the CDC order really spoke to about how any eviction, regardless of the cause, even if it wasn't around non-payment, that is still a health issue. You know, the family in Richmond that was not able to pay rent in January, they could be evicted, you know, during a pandemic still. And of course, that's not fair. I don't believe that it needs to be related to COVID. And so we just need to do all we can, I think, to help close these gaps so that we can keep our people safe. So thank you so much, and I'll leave it there.